stage, we'll have devotions led by Jason Fileta. He grew up in Wheaton, Illinois, and is the son of Egyptian immigrants. The plight of the persecuted church in Egypt compelled him to dedicate his life to fighting for a more just world. He graduated from Calvin with a bachelor's in sociology and international development, and was then later chosen as a delegate at the G8 summit in Scotland. This and other events launched his work in advocacy focused around ending extreme poverty.
Jason is the director of Micah Challenge USA, a Christian movement to end extreme poverty that mobilizes people to challenge attitudes, behaviors, and policies that perpetuate injustice. Jason is the editor and contributing author to Live Justly, a book that has been read and taught throughout the United States and throughout the world. He is also the founder of Lion and Lamb Publishing that donates 50% of all profits to organizations that are advocating against injustice. Would you please join us in welcoming our devotional speaker, Jason Fileta.
That publishing thing sounds a lot cooler than it really is. That's cool, it made it into the bio. How's everybody doing? Did anybody else come from the West Coast? Well, it's a long journey. So I'm really thankful, and really thankful to Katie and Caitlin for inviting me, and yeah, I'm thankful I get the chance to do these devotions today, tomorrow, and the next day. So I figure because you're going to be hearing from me a little bit, it wouldn't hurt to know a little bit more about me. So you already heard where I grew up, that my parents immigrated here from Egypt. Funny story that I didn't even learn until I was in my 20s was that they actually came here to visit. They didn't intend to immigrate here. And then they just were here for 23 years before they went back to Egypt for the first time. And they came here and they experienced what my dad just describes as freedom. For like the first time in his life, he felt free. And that's why they stayed here. And he was like, this is where I have to have children. So I grew up in a really confusing space because on the one hand, me and my family were like on our knees praying, crying out to God to protect our family that was in a minority in Egypt and was living in parts of the country where their lives felt at risk sometimes. They lived in poverty. We had to send them medicine that they couldn't afford themselves. And we devoted a lot of our energy to praying for them and doing everything we could. And as a child, like I knew what political asylum was as a 5-year-old because it was just common talk, you know? And my heart really, really was with these people that were my family who I didn't even know. But at the same time, I was growing up in this really nice place. Like I was very privileged. I had a lot of, my family didn't go hungry. My family did have access to medicine. And that those two worlds collided when I went to Christian high school. Because it was there that I realized I had been worshiping a different God my whole life. The God that we knew heard our prayers for the persecuted and the oppressed. In my mind, how could this be the same God that we're at school desperately praying to use our soccer team to witness to the Catholic high school, as if they didn't already know Jesus? It was just a different world. It was a different understanding of who God was. And that made me really cynical and really confused. And I would say that I forgot who God really was. And it wasn't until I came to Calvin, actually, and I kind of ended up here as a fluke. That's a fun story. I'll tell you another time. And it was through professors here. It was through other students here, and really, it was through reading the Bible for the first time that I remembered who God was, and I remembered what He wanted from me. And so I really wanted to do something with international development. And I wanted to drop out because I was so sick of hearing, when you graduate is when you can go do X, Y, or Z. I was like, that's stupid. Like, why? The world is in desperate need of somebody to care. I care. Like, why am I wasting my time in Grand Rapids, Michigan? It's really cold here. And so my parents gave me the speech, we didn't come to this country and do everything we did to have you drop out of college. My professors were like, that's a really dumb idea. So I stayed, and I decided I need to figure out what can I do as a North American college student to have an impact on the world that my heart is breaking for. So that's how I got into advocacy and prayer and mobilization as these tools of like God's kingdom. And so by the time I graduated, instead of moving abroad to become an agriculturalist, which is kind of what I wanted to do, I was like, I want to do more of this advocacy stuff. And then I had the chance to in a number of ways and ended up with Micah Challenge. And what I thought was going to be a one-year internship kind of deal, this was in 2005, is now almost 12 years later, and it's still going. And so the nature of that work, because we do advocacy, is that we have to keep our finger on the pulse of injustice. And you are probably like me in that you're always reading the news. When you see some foreign country in a headline, your ears perk up. And we are always, sadly, like deeply, either mentally, emotionally, and sometimes physically invested in the despair of the world. And it is hard. The nature of what you want to do, if you want to work in any development sector, whether it's community development, relief work, or advocacy space where I work, at the end of the day, you are always trying to do something beyond you. You will always be around darkness. The hope is you'd bring some light, but it's hard. Should I stop there while it's really down? But yeah, I'm being really honest. Like, there are times when I lose hope. There are absolutely times where I wonder, does anything I do actually matter? Because the problems are so big. Has anything I've done with my life that I've now devoted 12 years to actually mattered? There are absolutely times where I question that and I lose hope. So, my experience is also connected to our world's experience because there is a lot of despair in the world. There's a lot of reasons to feel hopeless. I have a lot of friends who right now in particular are hopeless. They are cynical. They have exited whatever purpose they had and are just focusing on trying to enjoy and have a good time because they truly believe the world's going to end. And I have a lot of friends who don't take it that extreme, but who just feel in this time right now, in the midst of the greatest refugee crisis since World War II, in the midst of so much war, against this backdrop of climate change, which is apparently going to deeply, deeply affect the lives of millions of people over the next 50 years. People lose hope. And so I wanted to look at a scripture about a man who at times was hopeless, and he had it really rough. So we're going to talk about Job. If you don't know the story of Job, I'm going to give you the really brief background, and then I'm going to read you just the good part that suits my devotion, and then we'll talk more about it. I'm transparent. I'm an anti-corruption campaigner, so I have to be really transparent. So Job is a man who God called blameless, and the angels bring Satan to God, and Satan says, Job is only so devoted to you and blameless before you because his life is so good. The Bible describes the tally of his wealth. He has literally 7,000 camels. He has thousands of sheep, thousands of animals. He has 10 children. He has hundreds of servants. He has so much going for him. He's healthy. Everybody loves him. He works, and there's fruit of his labor. He's just doing good. So Job says, of course, or Satan says, of course Job is devoted to you because his life is good. Let me test that. God allows this, and Job loses everything. He loses his children. He loses his physical buildings. He loses all of his animals and livestock, all of his crops. He loses all of his servants, except the ones who were still alive in order to tell him the message that everything else was destroyed. And Job still doesn't curse God. He stays faithful. And his wife, well, we'll get to her in a second. She says the most depressing sentence I think I've ever heard in my entire life. Then Satan goes back to God and says, well, let me take his body. Like, let me harm his person. So God says, you can hurt him, but you have to keep him alive. So he gets sick. He gets these huge boils on his body. I mean, the guy is in bad shape. Like, it is hopeless. It's actually really depressing to read. His wife tells him to curse God and die, which I think is the just darkest sentence I've ever heard. Like, that is hopeless, to curse God and die. And Job's friends come to his aid to try and comfort him. And his friends, at first, they just sit in silence for 7 days because they are so afraid to speak. Like, they don't know what to say. They don't want to be the first one to say something. Finally, one of his friends speaks up. And just like in real life, he doesn't get right to the good stuff. He kind of fumbles and I would say gives Job some bad advice, makes Job think it's his fault this is happening to him. But it's somewhere in there, just like in real life, because when I give my friends advice, probably 80% of it is me fumbling toward the 20% that I've been wanting to say. So I'm going to pretend that's what this is. This is from Job 5. This is his friend's first speech to him, and this is what he reminds him of. Job 5, verse 8, "But if it were I would appeal to God. I would lay my cause before him. He performs wonders that cannot be fathomed, miracles that cannot be counted. He bestows rain on the earth. He sends water on the countryside. The lowly he sets on high, and those who mourn are lifted toward safety. He thwarts the plans of the crafty, so that their hands achieve no success. He catches the wise in their craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are swept away. Darkness comes upon them in the daytime. At noon they grope as in the nighttime. He saves the needy from the sword in their mouth. He saves them from the clutches of the powerful. So the poor have hope, and injustice shuts its mouth." So what Job's friend does here is, instead of feeding Job's anguish, instead of just telling Job, you've got it bad, which is what people do a lot of times in hopeless situations, is just remind people of how bad this situation is. His friends remind him who God is. In the midst of him being in this hopeless space, he reminds him who God is as a way to comfort him. So you might not feel like Job, and our world may not be as bad as Job's world was, but there is a lot of hopelessness in our world. And honestly, most of what I've been seeing from my community is toxic. The friends I have, the people I know, when there is despair or hopelessness in the world, people just feed it to each other. They want to be the angriest about something. Social media is like a competition to see who is the first to find this horrible thing and be the most upset about it. And that's toxic. It really is. And it will eat away at your soul. It really will. You can't feed yourself anger and cynicism. We need people who are prophets of hope. So when you face, whether it is today, whether it is in your own life, or whether it is far in the future, when you're working in some capacity in international development, I guarantee you will face a hopeless situation. You will maybe meet a person who seems hopeless, beyond redemption. You will see a situation or a community that seems hopeless or beyond redemption. You will feel hopeless. Maybe your team will feel hopeless. And when that happens, this is what I want to encourage you to do, is to remind yourself and remind the world who God is. Be like Job's friend, whose name I can't pronounce, and remind whoever is experiencing hopelessness who God is. That's what our job is. So as a quick reminder, who is God? God is someone who hears the cries of the oppressed. In Exodus 3, we hear that. God sees and hears his people enslaved in Egypt. He hears their cries and he sets them free. So God is someone who hears you, who hears the refugees right now who are living in conditions we can't even imagine around the world. He hears people experiencing poverty and hunger, and you better believe those people are praying. Absolutely they are praying. Absolutely they are praying. And God hears them. And it doesn't just apply to them. I really want to say it applies to us. You. If you're privileged enough to be in this room, it still applies to you. And I have spoken to big enough groups to know that in any room there is somebody and many people who have experienced horrible things in their life. Maybe it is abuse, maybe it is racism, maybe it is some kind of injustice, poverty, hunger, who knows? It has happened to someone, and you need to be reminded that God hears you. Absolutely. I read the Exodus story almost weekly to remind myself that God sees what I go through. And I know it applies to the rest of his creation. We see a God in the prophets who raises up prophet over and over and over to remind the powerful, to remind the kings, to remind the judges that God is watching them and that their actions that oppress other people are unacceptable. So he is fiercely opposed to oppression. That's who God is. And then we see a God who loves this world so relentlessly that he sends his own son. He sends Jesus to not just die, but to live, to show us how we are to live, to radically reconcile all things to himself. That's who God is. We see God go to the most hopeless, disgusting persecutor, Saul, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, and transform him from a persecutor to a preacher. We see God take that hopeless situation and use that very same man to convince Philemon. Have you ever read the book of Philemon? That's one of the books, I never read growing up, and then when I decided to read the Bible cover to cover, I got to it, and I was like, oh my gosh, why have I never heard a sermon on Philemon? God uses Paul to convince Philemon to break away from the culture, the norms, the law that he lived under, and embrace his runaway slave who has left, and call him beloved brother. Not just embrace him back as a slave, but as a brother. This is who God is. This is what God is about. So when it feels hopeless, when you see a hopeless situation, when you're reading the news and it overwhelms you and you're like, there is literally nothing I can do about this, remember who God is. That's your job. Remember who God is and believe that God is who he says he is. And that is the power of hope. Hope is not a fleeting emotion. Hope is not just a temporary condition you might feel. Hope is a sturdy walk towards the light. Hope is persistent, and that kind of persistence doesn't come just from watching an inspiring quick video or cats kissing or whatever it might be that inspires you for the moment. Hope is like a sustained struggle. And the only way I've been able to do that, as long as I have, which isn't that long, is by remembering who God is. Thank you.